Vel'Korath's left mandible clicked once, a sound like dry bones settling into wet socket, and the amber point on the perimeter display vanished. 14 species held seats in the post-human accords. None of them were human. They had not been for 300 years. The Archon's ceremonial mantle of star silk brushed the obsidian floor as he turned from the display. The chamber was 3 kilometers from floor to apex, grown from the calcified secretions of 10,000 Realoi architects, then hollowed and reinforced with Vethari battle steel. The air smelled of ozone and old incense, the kind that clings to stone after centuries of ceremonial smoke. Korath had worn this office for 212 years. He had never met a human. Absent, he said, and the word carried the weight of settled law. Not extinct, not dissolved, not surrendered, absent. The perimeter display showed 31 amber points now, drifting in formation at the edge of monitored space. 8 vessels, pre-departure designs. The Terran Continuity Authority had not filed approach vectors. They had simply appeared as if the galaxy had hiccuped and coughed up a ghost. Korath's synthetic eye, installed at age 600 after what the records called a diplomatic incident with the Tessari delegation, tracked the formation without blinking. The organic eye, the one he had been born with 847 years ago, narrowed at the data feed. The vessels were old, functional but old. Museum pieces, if museums still collected the machinery of extinct species. Sector reallocation, said a voice from the lower tier. 12 Delta requires formal. Deferred, Korath said. His mandible clicked again and the chamber fell silent. The doctrine was clear. The doctrine of constructive absence stated that any species uncontactable for 10 full cycles relinquished standing. Humanity had been absent for 30 cycles, 300 years. The vote to dissolve them had been cast 8-6. Not unanimous, but enough to build a cathedral on a grave that was never dug. Korath settled into the arbiter's seat. The star-silk mantle pooled around him like liquid night. He would let them approach. He would let them dock at Base 7, the secondary airlock last used for supply haulers. He would let them speak. And then he would remind them that the galaxy had moved on without them, that the law had moved on, that the very architecture of the Accords had been rebuilt in the space their absence had left behind. He did not know that the door was never locked. He simply assumed it was. I wish I could tell you it ended with a vote. It didn't. Stay close. 300 years earlier, or 300 years later, time is a circle when you sleep through it. The seed vessel Marrow dropped out of the dark between galaxies with a shudder that woke Ussold Vance from cryosleep. She did not gasp, she did not flail. She simply opened her eyes, felt the familiar pressure behind them that made the corridor lights blur, and waited for her body to remember it had a body. 40 years in the ice. 40 years of dreams she could not quite hold, slipping through her fingers like water. She was 67 years old by the calendar, 27 by the biology of her cells. The coat she had worn at departure, woven gray fabric repaired 14 times, hung in the locker beside her pod. She reached for it first, before the medical readouts, before the status reports, before anything that might tell her whether they had arrived at a welcome or a wall. The coat smelled of the ship, recycled air, the mineral bite of ion-filtered light. She pulled it on and walked to the bridge, her hands in her pockets, her voice still rough from disuse. Status, she said, and the word came out like gravel moving under slow water. Captain Holt did not look up from the navigation console. We're at the edge of monitored space. 8 vessels total including Marrow. The Accord spire is active. No hail, no challenge, no welcome. 300 years, Vance said. Not a question, a measurement. 300 years, Holt confirmed. And the borders they drew while we were gone don't leave room for us. Vance stood at the viewport. The Accord spire turned slowly against the void, a calcified needle catching the light of a distant star. She had been a diplomatic attaché to the Departure Council, back when departure was still a choice and not a necessity. She remembered the vote, 8-6, not unanimous. She had filed the dissent herself, watching the Kavani representative, a small, elder species with an average span of 134 years, hesitate before pressing her palm to the register. The Kavani had long memories, grandmother to granddaughter knowledge transfer. They understood what it meant to be forgotten. Base 7, Vance said. We'll dock at the secondary airlock, the one they use for supply haulers. Holt's jaw tightened. They're not going to offer us a seat, Ambassador. They're going to offer us a museum. Then we will accept the chair, Vance said, and let them vote. She did not sit in the bridge chair. The bridge chair was built for human anatomy, but she had learned in 40 years of diplomatic service and 40 years of frozen sleep that comfort was a trap. She stood, her hands in her coat pockets, and watched the spire grow larger on the display. In the observer's gallery of the Accords chamber, Lieutenant Kurasal of the Kavani had sat for 97 years. She was small, her skin the color of old parchment, her eyes the deep black of a species that had evolved in dim light. She had not spoken in 47 years. The Kavani kept the silent vigil, a tradition older than the Accords themselves, and Kurasal had kept it longest of all. Her hand rested on a fragment of transparent glass in her pocket. It had come from a human vessel, recovered from the debris field at the edge of the departure zone, where the last human ships had burned their engines before turning toward the intergalactic dark. She had carried it for 97 years. The edges were worn smooth by decades of thumb rubbing. It caught the light like a frozen breath. She watched the perimeter display. She watched the 31 amber points resolve into 8 vessels. She watched Velkoreth's mandible click, and she did not move. But her thumb rubbed the glass fragment once, twice, 3 times, and the frozen breath caught the chamber light and held it. Warden Brask of the Korvathi stood at the security station, his synthetic left eye whirring softly as he scanned the approaching formation. He was a veteran of the Consolidation Wars, 312 years old, his body augmented with the synthetic parts that had replaced what the wars had taken. The eye whirred when he was agitated. It was whirring now. Museum pieces, he said, and the word was almost a laugh. 8 vessels, pre-departure escort designs. 1 colony transport, 7 escorts. They crossed the intergalactic dark in museum pieces. Velkoreth's mandible clicked once, a sound almost like laughter, almost. Article 7, Kurasal whispered, and the word was so soft that no one heard it, not even her. It was a prayer, or a promise, or a memory passed from grandmother to granddaughter across the 97 years she had waited in the gallery. She did not know if the humans remembered Article 7. She only knew that she did. The marrow shuddered again as the docking clamps engaged at Base 7. Vance stood at the airlock, her coat pulled tight, her hands in her pockets. The corridor outside was 2.3 meters high, built for human hands, built for human shoulders, built in a time when humans had been part of the galaxy, not a footnote in its legal code. She stepped through the airlock. The gravity was slightly off, calibrated for a different center of mass, and she felt the familiar strain in her knees. She did not sit. She never sat in chairs built for non-human anatomy. It was a small refusal, a quiet resistance, but she had learned that small refusals accumulated. That quiet resistance, maintained across 300 years, could become a wall that the galaxy could not climb. Thessaly of the Realoi met her at the junction. She was 23 years old, barely mature by her species standards, her skin still soft from the final calcification. She was an archive reader, not a witness. She had never seen a human. She had expected them to be louder. "You are smaller than I imagined," Thessaly said. "I am older than I look," Vance replied. "And I have been waiting for a very long time." They walked through the corridors of the Accord spire, past the calcified walls and the reinforced steel, past the ozone smell and the old incense, past the 14 species that held seats and the one that did not. The corridors were 2.3 meters high. The doorways were built for human hands. The galaxy had forgotten who built them, but the architecture remembered. In the chamber, Vel-Korath waited. His star-silk mantle brushed the obsidian floor. His synthetic eye tracked the approach without blinking. His left mandible clicked once, a sound like dry bones settling into wet socket, and he prepared to tell the ghost that it was dead. He did not know that the ghost had brought a data chip. He did not know that the ghost had read Article 7, Section 4, 300 years ago, before the ice took her. He did not know that the door was never locked. He simply assumed it was. Vance did not wait for permission to enter the hearing chamber. She walked through the doors as if they had been built for her, which they had been, 2.3 meters of clearance that no current species needed, and stopped at the edge of the speaker's platform. The chamber had been hastily rearranged for 200 seats, a concession to the sudden appearance of 8 vessels in monitored space, but the observer's gallery remained unchanged. Kurasal sat in the back row, her hand in her pocket, her thumb moving across the glass fragment in a rhythm that had become indistinguishable from breathing. Vel-Korath rose from the arbiter's seat. The star-silk mantle did not flow with him. It dragged, as if the fabric itself had grown heavy with the years. "Observer status," he said. "The Terran Continuity Authority may register as observers of the post-human accords. Your vessels will be logged. Your approach will be noted. Then we shall let them vote," Vance said. She did not raise her voice. The gravel in it simply settled deeper, like sediment at the bottom of a river that had not stopped moving for 300 years. She did not sit in the chair they had provided. It was built for a Vethari center of mass, too low in the back, too wide in the seat, and she remained standing, her hands in her coat pockets, her shoulders level with the 2.3-meter ceiling that pressed down above her like a held breath. Korath's mandible clicked. Your standing was dissolved by doctrine of constructive absence, 30 cycles of uncontactability. The vote was 8-6, Vance said, not unanimous. The chamber was not silent. Chambers this size are never silent. The air recyclers hummed. The realloy calcification in the walls ticked as it settled, but something in the quality of the silence changed, as if the room itself had held its breath. Kurasal's thumb stopped moving on the glass fragment. Brask's synthetic I word once, a sound like a fly trapped in a jar. Not, Korath repeated, unanimous. Vance pulled her right hand from her pocket. She held nothing in it. The empty hand was the gesture, the open palm that diplomats use when they have nothing to hide and everything to prove. Article 7, she said. Section 4. I memorized it before the ice took me. Would you like me to recite it, or would you prefer to read it from your own archives? Korath's synthetic eye did not blink. It could not blink. But the organic eye narrowed and the mandible clicked again, rapid this time, a sound like dry bone tapping against dry bone. The doctrine is clear, he said. The vote was sufficient, the standing was. Absent, Vance said, not extinct, not dissolved. Not surrendered, absent. She turned from the platform and walked to the edge of the chamber, where the walls curved upward in the realloy calcification pattern, white and ridged like the inside of a shell. She reached up. She did not need to reach far. The ceiling was built for her and touched the wall. Her fingers fit the grooves. The grooves had been made for human hands in a time when humans had helped grow the spire, before the secretions had been reinforced with battle steel, before the accords had been renamed post-human. You reallocated our sectors, she said, 270 years ago, who signed the post-human accords. Korath did not answer. The question was not rhetorical, but it was unanswerable, and they both knew it. The accords had been signed by 14 species. The humans had been absent. The humans had been absent, and the galaxy had moved the borders, and the Vethari had built 400 capital ships at the edge of the contested zone, and the architecture of an empire had been constructed on the assumption that the foundation was dead. "Sector 12 Delta," Korath said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had built a cathedral on a grave that was never dug, and who was only now hearing the first creak of the foundation. "Requires formal reallocation. The Vethari claim has been uncontested for." "Uncontested," Vance said. "Yes, because we were absent. Because we were mining the intergalactic dark, where your scanners do not reach, where your laws do not extend, where your doctrine of constructive absence does not apply. We were absent. We were not gone." She turned back to face the chamber. The 200 seats were filling now, species representatives summoned from their quarters by the sudden arrival, the sudden disruption, the sudden ghost that would not behave like a ghost. Thessaly stood at the entrance, her young Realloy skin still soft, her eyes moving from Vance to Korath to the 2.3-meter ceiling that she had never questioned because she had never known to question it. 8 vessels, Brask said from the security station. His voice was the voice of a soldier who had learned to measure threat in tonnage and firepower, not in legal precedent. 1 colony transport, 7 escort designs, pre-departure technology, museum pieces. Vance looked at him. She did not smile. She did not frown. Her face was the face of a woman who had slept for 40 years and woken to find that her enemies had grown old in her absence, that their certainties had calcified like Realloy secretions, that their power had become brittle with the years. "Museum pieces," she repeated. "Yes, we crossed the intergalactic dark in museum pieces. We mined void iron in museum pieces. We survived in museum pieces while you built your fleets in the light and assumed the dark was empty." She walked back to the platform. She did not sit. She stood, her hands in her pockets, and looked at the 200 representatives of 14 species, none of them human, all of them suddenly aware that the chamber they sat in had been built with human proportions, that the doors they had entered through were wide enough for human shoulders, that the very language of the Accord still carried human grammatical structures that no translation software had ever fully resolved. "Article 7, she said again. Section 4. No species may be removed from standing without formal declaration of dissolution, signed by the species in question, or by unanimous vote of all standing members." Korath's mandible clicked 3 times, rapid, unconscious. The vote was 8-6, the standing was dissolved. The doctrine of constructive absence," Vance said, "is a procedural evaluation. It is not a declaration of dissolution. It is not a signature. It is a bureaucratic convenience, a way to move the borders without asking the people who live behind them. You did not dissolve us. You reclassified us. You declared us emergent. You declared us absent. You did not declare us extinct, because to declare us extinct would require proof, and proof would require looking, and looking would require admitting that the dark between galaxies might not be empty after all." She paused. The air recycler hummed. The Realloy calcification ticked. Somewhere in the gallery, Kurasal's thumb began to move again across the glass fragment, and the frozen breath caught the chamber light and held it. 8 vessels, Vance said, and her voice was quieter now, the gravel settling into something almost gentle, almost like a lullaby. 12,000 tons of refined void iron, 300 years of mining in the intergalactic dark, enough to build a fleet, or to buy one. The chamber did not erupt. There was no shouting, no movement, no sudden chaos of species rising from their seats. There was only the silence that follows a blow that has not yet registered, the moment between impact and pain when the body does not yet know it has been struck. Korath's synthetic eye stopped moving. The mechanism that tracked and calculated and processed data, the mechanism that had been installed when he was 600 years old and had seen him through 212 years of procedural certainty, simply stopped. The organic eye remained fixed on Vance, and in it was something that had not been there before. Not fear. Not yet. the space where fear would grow if given time. "You built a cathedral," Vance said, "on a grave that was never dug." She turned from the platform and walked to the edge of the chamber, where Thessaly stood with her young eyes wide and her soft skin pale. Vance did not touch her. She only looked at the ceiling, at the 2.3 meters of rheoloid calcification that had been grown with human hands in mind, and then she looked back at Korath. "The door was never locked," she said. "You simply assumed it was." She walked to the door. She did not look back. The 200 representatives of 14 species watched her go, and none of them spoke, because none of them knew what words could follow a ghost that had walked through walls they had forgotten were doors. In the gallery, Kurasal stood. She had not stood in 47 years. Her legs were unsteady, her small Kavani frame trembling with the effort, but she stood, and her hand was in her pocket, and the glass fragment was warm from her thumb. She looked at the door where Vance had disappeared, and then she looked at Vel Korath, who sat in the arbiter's seat with his star-silk mantle pooled around him like liquid night, and his synthetic eye frozen, and his left mandible clicking, 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 a sound like dry bones settling into wet socket, a sound like a cathedral foundation cracking. She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 47 years. Kurasal's legs shook, but she did not sit. She walked down the gallery steps, her small Kavani feet finding the grooves that human architects had left in the calcified stone, and stopped at the edge of the speaker's platform. Vel Korath did not look at her. His synthetic eye was still frozen. The mechanism that had tracked data for 2 centuries of procedural certainty locked in place, and his organic eye stared at the door where Vance had disappeared. "The vote," Kurasal said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had not spoken in half a lifetime, rough with disuse but clear with the precision of a grandmother's memory passed through generations of silent vigil. "Was 8-6. The Kavani dissented, the Tessari dissented, the Rheoloi of that generation dissented. We were small, we were politically marginal, but we remembered." Korath's mandible clicked, once, a sound like a stone dropping into still water. "You sat in the gallery," he said. "For a lifetime of waiting, you never petitioned, you never spoke. You never." "We watched," Kurasal said. Her hand was still in her pocket, the glass fragment warm against her palm, the frozen breath catching the chamber light as she drew it out and held it up between her thumb and forefinger. "We watched because watching is what the Kavani do. We remember because memory is what the small survive on. You built your empire on a procedural error, Archon, and we let you build it because we knew the humans would return. We knew because," she turned the fragment, and the light moved through it like a held breath, like a promise kept across the dark between galaxies, "because we found this. In the debris field at the edge of the departure zone, 97 years ago, a piece of a human vessel, proof that they had gone into the dark, not into death. Proof that the grave was never dug." The chamber breathed, the air recyclers hummed, the rheoloid calcification ticked, and in the security station, Brask's synthetic eye whirred once, a sound like a fly trapped in a jar, and then fell silent. Korath stood. The star-silk mantle dragged behind him, heavy with the years, heavy with the 2 centuries of certainty that had settled into the fabric like dust. He walked to the edge of the platform and looked down at Kurasal, at the fragment of glass in her hand, at the small Kavani woman who had outweighted him. "The doctrine of constructive absence," he said, and the words were the words of a man who had built a cathedral and was only now noticing that the foundation was sand, "is not a dissolution. It is a reclassification. A procedural evaluation. The standing of humanity was not removed, it was suspended, and suspended standing can be restored," Vance said. She stood in the doorway, her coat pulled tight, her hands in her pockets, her shoulders level with the 2.3-meter ceiling. She had not gone far. She had walked to the end of the corridor, touched the wall where the grooves fit her fingers, and waited. Waiting was what she had learned in 40 years of cryosleep. Waiting was what the humans had learned in 3 centuries of mining the dark. The galaxy had never learned to measure time in centuries. The galaxy had measured time in votes, in sessions, in the rapid turnover of species whose lifespans were brief as sparks. Restored, she repeated, and walked back to the platform. She did not look at Curaçao. She did not need to. The Cavani woman had kept the vigil, and the vigil was its own language, older than the Accords, older than the doctrine, older than the procedural arrogance that had mistaken silence for surrender. Article 7, Vance said, Section 4. No species may be removed from standing without formal declaration of dissolution, signed by the species in question or by unanimous vote of all standing members. The vote was 8-6, not unanimous. The doctrine of constructive absence is not a declaration of dissolution. It is a procedural convenience, and procedural conveniences do not dissolve standing. They only suspend it. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a data chip, small, old. Pre-departure design, the kind that stored information in crystalline lattices that did not degrade in cryosleep, that did not require the cloud architectures that the galaxy had moved on to, that did not need the permission of a server to exist. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger, and the chamber light caught it like the glass fragment caught the light, like a held breath, like a promise. Specialist Okonkwo, she said. A woman stepped forward from the group of humans who had followed Vance from the marrow. She was young, her skin dark, her hands steady. She wore a chipped ceramic mug on a lanyard around her neck, the kind of mug that soldiers carried in the field, that diplomats carried on long voyages, that had been filled with something that was not quite tea for 3 centuries of routine. She reached the metal table at the center of the platform, set the mug down, and the sound of ceramic on metal was the loudest sound in the chamber. It was a mundane sound, the sound of a woman setting down her morning drink before beginning her work, the sound of routine, of habit, of the small, ordinary gestures that outlast empires. The sound of a human being who had crossed the intergalactic dark in museum pieces, who had mined void iron in the spaces between galaxies, who had kept the law in her pocket, while the galaxy had rewritten the law to forget her. Article 7, Okonkwo said, Section 4. She did not shout. She did not declaim. She simply spoke the words, and the words were the words that had been written 300 years ago by human hands, in a chamber that had been built for human proportions, by a council that had included human representatives, before the departure, before the absence, before the doctrine that had mistaken silence for surrender. No species may be removed from standing, Okonkwo said, without formal declaration of dissolution, signed by the species in question, or by unanimous vote of all standing members. She set the data chip on the table beside the mug. The ceramic was chipped at the rim, worn smooth by decades of lips, stained with the residue of something that was not quite tea. The chip was old, functional, pre-departure. The 2 objects sat together on the metal surface, and the steam still rose from the mug, and the chamber watched, and the silence was not empty. It was full of 3 centuries of assumption, collapsing into a single, unsigned document, full of the realization that the door was never locked, full of the weight of a cathedral built on a grave that was never dug, and the sound of the foundation cracking, dry bone on dry bone, star silk dragging on obsidian, the whir of a synthetic eye that had stopped moving and would not start again. Vel Korath looked at the mug. He looked at the chip. He looked at Vance, who stood with her hands in her coat pockets, her shoulders level with the 2.3-meter ceiling, her voice like gravel moving under slow water. You cannot, he said, simply return. You cannot simply walk back into a galaxy that has moved on, that has reallocated your sectors, that has built its borders on the assumption of your absence. You cannot simply. We did not simply return, Vance said. We prepared. We mined the intergalactic dark for 3 centuries. We refined 12,000 tons of void iron. We built a fleet in the dark, or we bought the capacity to build one. We did not simply return, Archon. We waited. We measured time in centuries because that is the only measure that matters when you are absent but not gone. And now we stand in a chamber that was built for our hands, under a ceiling that was built for our height, and we ask you to recognize what your own law has always recognized. That we were absent, that we were not dissolved, that the door was never locked. Koreth's mandible clicked, 3 times, rapid, unconscious. The sound of a man who had built an empire on a procedural error and was watching the error become visible, become tangible, become a chipped ceramic mug and a data chip on a metal table, become the steam rising from something that was not quite tea, become the 2.3-meter ceiling pressing down above him like a held breath. The vote, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had not spoken in a language that admitted doubt for 2 centuries, to retroactively dissolve, would require unanimity. The original vote was 8-6, the 6 who dissented. Still hold standing, Vance said. The Kavani, the Tessari, the Realoi of the generation that voted, their descendants carry their standing, their descendants carry their descent. And the 8 who voted to dissolve, she paused, and the gravel in her voice settled deeper, like sediment at the bottom of a river that had not stopped moving for 3 centuries. The 8 who voted to dissolve built their borders on the assumption that the 6 were wrong, that the 6 were politically marginal, that the 6 were small, that the 6 could be ignored. And now the 6 hold the law, and the 8 hold the fiction. The chamber breathed, the air recyclers hummed, the Realoi calcification ticked, and in the security station, Brask's synthetic I-word once, a single sound like a fly trapped in a jar and then died. The eye went dark. The mechanism that had tracked and calculated and processed threat in tonnage and firepower, not in legal precedent, simply stopped. He reached up and touched the dead lens, and his fingers came away with nothing. No data, no reading, no threat assessment that could tell him what to do when the threat was not tonnage but truth. The 400 ships, he said, and his voice was the voice of a soldier who had learned that the war he had prepared for was not the war that had arrived. At Sector 12 Delta, they were positioned for intimidation, for border enforcement, for the assumption that the contested zone was empty. They are not positioned for defense, Vance said. No, they are not, because the contested zone was never empty. It was only absent, and absence, Warden Brask, is not the same as emptiness. The 12,000 tons of void iron are not a fleet. They are a currency. They are the currency of a species that has learned to measure time in centuries, that has learned to build in the dark, that has learned to wait. And the galaxy has not learned to wait. The galaxy has learned to move quickly, to vote quickly, to reallocate quickly, to build cathedrals on graves that were never dug. The galaxy has learned to mistake silence for surrender, and now the silence is speaking. She turned from the platform and walked to the edge of the chamber, where Thessaly stood with her young eyes wide and her soft skin pale. Vance did not touch her. She only looked at the ceiling, at the 2.3 meters of Realoi calcification that had been grown with human hands in mind, and then she looked back at Koreth. The door was never locked, she said. You simply assumed it was. She walked to the door. She did not look back, but at the threshold she stopped. She turned. Her hand was in her coat pocket and she pulled it out, and in it was nothing. The empty hand, the open palm, the gesture of a diplomat who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. One more thing, she said, and her voice was quieter now, almost gentle, almost like a lullaby. The 8 vessels that brought us here, they are not our fleet, they are our proof. The fleet is still in the dark. The fleet is still mining. The fleet is still waiting, and it will wait for as long as it takes. Because we measure time in centuries, Archon, and you have only learned to measure it in votes. She walked through the door. The 2.3-meter ceiling framed her for a moment, a silhouette against the light of the corridor, and then she was gone. Kurasal stood at the platform edge, the glass fragment still held between her thumb and forefinger. She looked at Koreth. who sat in the arbiter's seat with his star-silk mantle pooled around him like liquid night, and his synthetic eye frozen, and his left mandible clicking, clicking, clicking. She looked at Brask, who stood at the security station with his dead synthetic eye and his living hand pressed against the console. She looked at the 200 representatives of 14 species, none of them human, all of them suddenly aware that the chamber they sat in had been built with human proportions, that the doors they had entered through were wide enough for human shoulders, that the very language of the Accord still carried human grammatical structures that no translation software had ever fully resolved. She walked to the metal table. She set the glass fragment down beside the chipped ceramic mug and the data chip. The frozen breath caught the chamber light and held it. The steam still rose from the mug. The chip sat silent, its crystalline lattice storing the law that had never been dissolved, only forgotten. "The quiet door," Kurasal said, and her voice was the voice of a grandmother speaking to a granddaughter who was not yet born, passing the memory across the generations of the silent vigil, "was never closed. You simply stopped looking at it." She turned and walked to the door. Her legs were steady now. She did not look back. Velkoreth sat in the arbiter's seat for 9 seconds after Kurasal walked through the door. He did not move. The star-silk mantle pooled around him like liquid night, and for the first time in 2 centuries of procedural certainty, the fabric felt heavy. Not ceremonial, not majestic, heavy, the weight of a shroud that had been worn to a coronation. The chamber breathed, the air recyclers hummed, the realloy calcification ticked. And then Koreth's mandible clicked 3 times, rapid, unconscious, a sound like dry bone tapping against dry bone, and he stood. "Session adjourned," he said, and the words were the words of a man who had built a cathedral and was now watching the congregation file out through doors he had forgotten were exits. He did not call for a vote. He did not call for a second motion. He simply adjourned, and the procedural collapse was complete. The 200 representatives of 14 species rose from their seats. None of them spoke. None of them knew what words could follow a silence that had spoken for 3 centuries. They filed toward the doors, and the doors were wide enough for human shoulders, and the ceiling pressed down above them at 2.3 meters, and the grooves in the calcified stone fit human fingers, and none of them had ever noticed because none of them had ever been taught to look. Brask stood at the security station. His dead synthetic eye was a dark lens in a face that had measured threat in tonnage and firepower for 3 centuries of consolidation wars. He reached up and touched it again, and his fingers came away with nothing, and he understood that the threat he had prepared for was not the threat that had arrived. The threat was not 12,000 tons of void iron. The threat was not a fleet in the dark. The threat was a chipped ceramic mug on a metal table, and a data chip, and a fragment of glass that caught the light like a frozen breath. He keyed the console. The 400 ships at Sector 12 Delta received new orders, not intimidation, not enforcement, repositioning, defense. The contested zone was not empty. The contested zone had never been empty. The contested zone was absent, and absence was not emptiness, and the ships that had been positioned to guard a fiction now guarded a truth that had not yet finished becoming real. The 8 species that had voted to dissolve humanity filed immediate border contests. The 6 that had dissented filed standing reaffirmations. The procedural chaos spread outward from the Accord's spire like a wave, and the wave carried with it the realization that 3 centuries of border architecture had been built on a single unsigned document, a single procedural error, a single assumption that silence meant surrender. Koreth walked to the metal table. He stood before it for a long moment, the star-silk mantle dragging behind him, and he looked at the 3 objects that had dissolved an empire without firing a shot. The chipped ceramic mug, steam still rising from something that was not quite tea. The data chip, old and functional and silent. The glass fragment, catching the chamber light like a frozen breath, like a held promise, like the last thing humanity had left behind, and the first thing that proved they had never left at all. He did not touch them. He turned and walked to the door, and his mandible clicked once, a sound like a stone dropping into still water, and he did not look back. He would not return to the arbiter's seat. He would not return to the office he had held for 2 centuries. He would walk into the corridors of the spire, and the corridors were 2.3 meters high, and the grooves fit his fingers, and he would understand for the first time that the architecture he had inherited was not his own. Thessaly stood in the doorway. She was young, barely mature by Realloy standards, her skin still soft from the final calcification. She had expected humans to be louder. She had expected conquest to be louder. She had expected the collapse of 3 centuries of certainty to be louder. But it was quiet. It was the quiet of a chipped ceramic mug on a metal table. It was the quiet of a data chip in a silent chamber. It was the quiet of a glass fragment catching the light like a frozen breath. She walked to the table. She did not touch the mug. She did not touch the chip. She reached out and touched the glass fragment, and her fingers fit the worn edges where a Cavani thumb had rubbed for a lifetime of waiting, and she understood that the real war had not ended. The real war had just begun, not a war of ships and void iron. A war of memory against forgetting. A war of architecture against assumption. A war of the small against the powerful, fought not with weapons but with the patience to outweight empires. She closed her fingers around the glass fragment. It was warm from Curaçao's palm, still carrying the heat of a vigil kept across generations. She walked to the gallery where Curaçao had sat for a lifetime of waiting, and she sat in the same seat, and she looked at the empty chamber, and she held the fragment up to the light. The light moved through it, a frozen breath, a held promise, a single piece of proof that the galaxy had built its empire on a procedural error, that the door was never locked, that the silence was never surrender. She sat with it for an hour. She would live to see the wars this moment started. She would live to see the borders redrawn, the accords rewritten, the architecture of an empire dismantled and rebuilt. She would live to see the humans return not as ghosts but as architects, not as memories but as hands, and she would understand that the chamber she sat in had been built for them, and the grooves in the stone had been cut for their fingers, and the ceiling had been grown to their height, and the galaxy had forgotten only because it had chosen to forget. She set the fragment on the floor beside her. It caught the chamber light like a single frozen breath, the last thing humanity left behind, the first thing that proved they had never left at all. The door was never locked. The galaxy had simply assumed it was.